Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to talk about something that sits right on that edge between history, superstition, and psychology, the hex. It's one of those words that instantly brings up images of witches, old magic, and curses carved into the air. But the story of the hex and the belief in it is far older, far broader, and far more human than you might think. Because long before Hollywood turned witches into icons and horror into entertainment, hexes were about control. Control over fate, control over fear, and control over power itself. So, let's go back. Way back. The word hex itself comes from the German Hex, meaning witch. It traveled with German immigrants, especially the Pennsylvania Dutch, and by the 1700s, hex signs were a part of rural American folklore. But the practice, the idea of a hex, predates that word by thousands of years. In the ancient world, what we now call a hex was simply a ritualized act of intention, and it was everywhere. People there believed words had actual physical power. Curses and blessings were written on clay tablets and buried near homes or crossroads. The Sumerians even had a goddess of spells, Jeshtanana, who could bind or unbind fate. If you wronged someone, they might commission a professional sorcerer to make a siptu, a binding incantation, calling upon the gods to make your crops fail or your livestock barren. And interestingly, they didn't think of this as evil. It was just one more part of the invisible economy of power that kept the universe balanced. Move west to ancient Egypt, and you find similar beliefs. The Egyptians called it Heka, a sacred force that connected gods and humans. Heka wasn't witchcraft in the negative sense, it was divine speech. Pharaohs, priests, and healers all used Heka. But so did common people. Amulets inscribed with spells were buried with the dead to protect them. Clay figurines representing enemies were broken and burned to neutralize threats. A hex in this world wasn't taboo, it was justice, prayer, and protection all at once. Now, skip ahead to Greece and Rome, where we start to see the tension that would define hexes for centuries. The Greeks had curse tablets. Thousands have been found, thin sheets of lead, rolled up and nailed into graves or wells. A merchant might curse a rival's business by saying something like, "Bind the tongues, hands, and minds of those who compete with me." A lover might hex the person who stole their beloved's heart. The Romans took it further, blending religion, superstition, and early psychology. One historian wrote that Augustus himself feared hexes, banning certain rituals and condemning people who practiced them. But here's the irony: Roman generals carried charms, wore enchanted rings, and made sacrifices before battle. Even emperors couldn't escape the idea that words could and will alter the world. Then Christianity enters the scene. With it came new categories: miracle versus magic, blessing versus curse. The church didn't erase the belief in hexes, it simply renamed it. What had once been binding magic was now the devil's work. And so we see the rise of the witch hunts, the Inquisition, and the long European obsession with maleficium, harmful magic. From the 1400s to the 1600s, thousands were accused of casting hexes that caused storms, spoiled milk, or made people ill. But the interesting part is that even while society condemned witchcraft, the same communities still used charms, talismans, and counter-hexes. You might denounce your neighbor as a witch one day, and hang a quote-unquote witch bottle of pins and herbs by your door the next. Fear of hexes never disappeared, it just changed its wardrobe. Let's cross the ocean now. When European settlers came to America, they brought their hex traditions with them, especially the Germans who settled in Pennsylvania. They painted hex signs, bright, geometric symbols, on barns. Now, these weren't curses. In fact, they were the opposite: protective symbols. Stars, tulips, circles, each with a meaning: protection from lightning, prosperity in harvest, harmony in the home. But nearby communities, especially English-speaking settlers, misunderstood them. They saw the word hex and assumed it meant witch sign. It's a perfect example of how cultural misunderstanding can turn folk art into folklore, and folklore into fear. This brings us to the 20th century, and a strange little story out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you're from that area, you might know what I'm about to say. The Hex House. It's one of those local legends that lives halfway between crime and myth. In 1944, police investigated the home of a woman named Carol Ann Smith. Neighbors had long whispered about strange things happening there. Curtains always drawn, odd smells, and rumors that Smith was a witch. When officers went inside, they found two women living in what they described as a state of enslavement. They were mentally manipulated, starved, and forced to work for Smith under the guise of spiritual obedience. The newspapers called it the Hex House. And suddenly, in the middle of the 20th century, America had its own witch house, a modern echo of ancient fear. The story became so famous that Tulsa still runs a Halloween attraction called the Hex House. But few remember that the real case was less about the supernatural and more about the terrifying power of psychological control. And that's the thread that connects it all, from Sumerian curses to modern headlines. The idea of a hex has always been about control. Sometimes it's fear of losing control. Sometimes it's the illusion of regaining it. And sometimes it's Let's zoom out for a moment. Across world cultures, hexes, or curses, played multiple roles. In West African traditions, curses were woven into community justice systems. A curse wasn't just malice, it was often a warning or a moral boundary. In East Asia, charms and calligraphy served the same function: protection, healing, redirection of negative energy. In indigenous American cultures, stories of shape-shifting or bad medicine existed alongside healing rituals. Every community recognized that power had two sides. And the fascinating thing is, none of these cultures saw hexes as pure evil. They saw them as tools, dangerous, yes, but part of the balance between the seen and unseen. Now, in modern times we talk about hexes again, but differently. You'll see people online selling hex jars or binding spells on social media. You'll hear about curses lifted or energy cleansed. The language is ancient, but the context is psychological. Because what used to be seen as supernatural warfare is now often emotional healing. People use the word hex to describe bad luck, negativity, or trauma that they're trying to release. In other words, the meaning has evolved, but the impulse hasn't. We still want a sense of power over chaos. So, what do we make of it all? Maybe the story of hexes isn't really about magic at all. Maybe it's about what happens when people feel powerless and what they do to reclaim a sense of agency. Ancient people wrote curses on lead tablets. Farmers painted hex signs on barns. Modern people light candles and scroll through wellness TikToks. Different rituals and the same need. To feel that somehow, in a world full of forces beyond our control, our words still have weight. And maybe that's the final truth about the hex, not that it's dark or dangerous, but that it reminds us how deeply we believe in the power of intention. From ancient Sumer to Oklahoma, from clay tablets to hashtags, the hex has always been our mirror, reflecting our hopes, our fears, and our need to make sense of the unseen. And maybe the best magic of all is this. The more we understand why we believe, the less we have to fear what we don't. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a comment or share it with someone who loves history and mystery. And remember, knowledge is the best counterspell.